How's it going, everyone? Welcome. Julian Gonzalez. You know. Well, in today's video, I want to take now a quick recap of how do we get here with CSS. So by looking at the fundamentals, what are the things that CSS allows to do? What are the basic building block and concept that we need to have that tattoo? What are the things that are relevant in 2025 on web development, and explore now is the rendering logic, aka how now is that the browser renders all of these particularly elements in the DOM and then transform into these elements like a box in any visual screen, any virtual media screen. So for example, like screens, also speech synthesizer is another one, but for our case is just this. And by understanding now how competing CSS actually make their way up to the final, how competing CSS make their way up to the final style known as the cascading style, and how this is made of. This is made of several tiers, so the further it fall into this tier, the less likely is for that style to be applied, right? And then understand now the flow content directions. So we have now inlines and block, and because now our content is now consumed by other peoples across the world, globe, and different cultures. So for example, not only in Western civilizations and cultures, when we read things from left to right, but also in the Middle East, when they read things from right to left, or even hand-based character. Even though that this is quite not familiar, or this is not quite popular, right? When you have now this top, bottom, and left, right, it is at least important to understand the flow direction, right? The content direction, and that's what we have now. Logical properties to go with, and now understand that everything here in CSS by the browser, it now transforms all of these different HTML tags into a box known as the box model. So this box, which is made of several layers that describe is the content, the padding, the border, and the margin. So each one of them has their own particular properties, and how you can describe is their values. So padding is by, you can think of this like when you do a winter walk, for those who who now go and do and can have or experience winter. All right. You put of course several layers on top of that. So this analogy of this winter walk, when you put now for example a code, in this code you might think that you are the content, and then the fluffy material, it is the padding, the border is the thin layer material, usually made of polyester or some sort of isolated material. And then you have now the margin, the safe space that we all must have. So in the case of padding, we look at what are the way of how you can define these values, in with borders, which is not that similar to padding or margins, and you can actually provide some round corners. Also outline, which is not part of the box model, so it's not including in the calculation, but it's served, for example, as providing hints to users going with assistant technologies. Now, having said that, then the next thing is, well, How can we now is look at the margin, and that the margin define their value similar like the pattern, and this padding margins, it has some specific behaviors, right? So for example, negative margins and something known as margin collapse. Okay, so again, this is the box model, or you can summarize this. This is how we summarize this. And because now CSS behave more like a set of mini language that you can apply to each one of those boxes, known as the layout algorithm. So by default, you have is the normal flow, right? Which goes or applies, or it is made of three types of blocks. You have now the block elements that takes all the available horizontal space. It is greedy, all right? It doesn't line break. You also have line or inline elements that actually it takes only the available width space, and it actually line break, right? Some other HTML element tags, so some elements like image, canvas, or video, they indeed behave like an inline elements, but you can modify its dimensions. Something that is not true for other inline elements, where you can modify its dimensions. Unlike now block elements, you can modify its dimension. And then you have now the inline elements, which is like a block or an inline in block clothing, right? So internally it behaves like a block element, but externally like an inline element. So that's something great to go and to understand. And this is the part of the normal flow. And when it comes to calculate the dimension of this box, whether it is a width and the height, so the TLDR is that width always look at down the tree. Sorry, the width always look at up the tree. All right. When you use now auto on the percentage, right, which is part of the two type of measurements that we can have to calculate is the width and the height of a box. Whether it is the percentage values, right? So for example, the percentage, the auto, and also you have is now pixels, root and element, and pixels, root and pixels, root end. So you have now is measurements when you have no percentage. You have auto, pixels, and root elements, and then you have also keywords. And those keywords, for example, fit content, you are telling now to that box that the width will be flexible, aka their content. I want you to now set the width based on the content. You can also say, hey, I want to take the max width of this, which is, hey, let's going to take is the small with elements over a change of collections, right? So we're gonna change all of this with elements, and they're gonna take all the available horizontal space. If you for some reason wants to take only is the mean height, the mean width, by saying, hey, I just want to take a look at the nested children's elements, and then the widest, that'll be our width. Okay. All right. So far, so good. No, nothing too fancy here. We can also try to play here with block and inline elements to see how the things work and so on and so forth. And that was quite interesting, I must say. And then we look at how the height is calculated. So this, unlike width, that is calculating is based on the, especially if you're using percentage, is gonna, or if you don't specify the width, all right. So by default, it's going to look up the tree to compute it is width, but in the case of height, it's going to look down the tree, and by default, it takes the minimum height possible here. So it's pretty much behave like a min width, but for height, right? So one tricky thing here is that if you want to, for example, define a box that takes all the available space, so for example here like that, right, to take all the the height space from here to here, right? So if you used 100%, it won't work unless you now at the root of the HTML document you specify that height, and then you pass down that value onto the proper element that you're gonna go with, right? So if you're using React or Next applications, so it might see some, or you might want to use is, or you might need to define is the 100% in one of their own custom CSS variables, and the height property, so you can pass down that value. And if you're working for mobile applications, if you're developing in mobile apps, well, because now the address bar and the footers actually are part of the screen, but they take space of the visual viewport. Well, to fix this is why we have now SVG, or small viewport height. Traditionally we have is the viewport height, but it's because of that problem that viewport height is taking is the entire height screen. And if you have a mobile, again, as I mentioned before, you have an address bar that taking more space in the content, so you get, so the content gets taller, right? It's not fit on that screen. So to fix that, we can use this now SVH, which I do find that that's quite interesting and also useful if you're developing mobile applications in this. And once we know is how the width and the height is calculated by default, and it is measurement, or it is type of value, whether it's measurement or keywords, then we look at the property known as margin collapse. All of these are exclusively to this layout algorithm, to the normal flow or the flow layout. So the margin collapse stands for, hey, if you have now content side by side, so their margins now can collapse. So this config in theory is quite straightforward, but in practice it has so many cover, or so have a lot of use cases that it becomes quite hard to actually get a sense or an intuition about it. So the TLDR of this, right, is that margins collapse vertically, all right? Margins can overlaps. The bigger margins wins, and there's some other rules applies to that. Remember, margins collapse only on the flow layer. So this first overview on this on the normal layout, right? I do think that's quite revealing in terms of now you actually understand, not only theory but also in practice, because also we look at how can we create is now a small website agency using only is the normal flow, and then we look at the another layout algorithm known as the positioning. So far with the normal flow, all the elements are orderly. So all of these elements are sorted, or are yeah, all of these elements are sorted one next to each other, right? But here with the positions, we can now take an element out of the normal flow, right? So we can now is overlapping context. So we can now overlaps context on the same pixel. And that's what we're going to explore in today's video. Let's take a look at this. And let's get into this. Now, here we are. Logging. Login. I think I log in with my GitHub. Yes. All right. Okay. Good. Good. There you got it. Relative rendering. Really? Oh, but this is CSS for JavaScript. Exactly. Okay. So now let's take a look at the rendering logic. Rendering logic 2. All right. And here is the relative positioning and absolute position. So relative positioning and absolute positioning. Dig it and dig it. So right. So in the last model we learned about the flow layout. It is the OG, the original against layout on the web, and it is not alone, right? So in the last model we learned about in the last model we learned about the normal flow or the flow layout, the flow layout, which is it is the OG, the original gangster. This is now when black cultures mix here, so on and so forth. So you get the idea. And it is inevitable. And it is inevitable. All right. Good. So, in the last model, we learned about this, right? Layout algorithm of the web, but it is not alone. In this section, we're going to look at another layout mode, positioning at layout. So this section is about learning another layout algorithm. The position layout, particularly relative position. The positioned layout, right? The positioned layout. How can I add this? The positioned layout. right? So if you use now italic, it's when you want to reference something or some scientific terms or TV series, books, or foreign words, right? Or even thoughts, right? The position layout, right? So the defining feature of position layout in it is that items can overlap. So the flow layout algorithm tries very hard to make sure that multiple elements never occupies the same pixel. Okay. So here, items can overlap. Okay. The flow layout algorithm tries very hard. Exactly. So the flow layout algorithm try very hard, or exactly because it's plural, tried very hard to never have an element occupying the same pixel. Okay. Or in this case, the flow layout algorithm tried very hard to never have multiple elements occupying the same pixel. But now here, with position layout, we can break out of the box. With position layout, we can break things out of the box. All right. So not only that, is that we can opt into position layout using the position property. Exactly. We can opt in this concept here. So we can opt in. We can opt into position layout. We can opt into position layout here. All right. So we can opt into position layout or position it we can opt into position layout with position property, right? Opt in. And it can be set relative, absolute, fixed, and sticky. So here we have relative, absolute, sticky, and fixed, right? Sticky and fixed. You also have is the default value of the position property is a static, right? But the position static or initial, all right, is a way of how you can opt out. You can set the position to either static or initial. If an element is currently position layout and you want to opt out, you can set position to either static or initial. If you need to opt out an element, okay, if you need to opt out an element, right? So if you need to opt out an element, with if you need to opt out a positioned element, you use is either static, okay, you use either static or initial, property. You either use you either use you 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 either use static or initial values here, as it is. Okay, but at the end of the day, I want to make this box so switch in, switch off, switch in, switch off. Okay, all right. Okay, makes a lot of sense. Okay, okay, all right. Okay, cool, cool. Mm-hmm. 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 Relative positioning. Of all position layout subgenres, relative is the most subtle. So you can often slap position relative on an element and observe zero difference. It appears to have no effect, and in fact is just too thin. It constrains certain children's elements, and you will get this shortly, and enables additional CSS property to be used. When we open into position layout, we enable a handful of CSS properties. Whether it's this position layout, whether it's relative, absolute, oh my god, I'm starting to look at this. Oh shit. Okay, 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 okay. So so what you're doing is like a switch, okay? Like a switch, like a switch. Mm-hmm. 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 It's like a switch. So this positioning layouts, all right, that actually now take, so multiple elements can be on the same pixel, right? So you can overlap elements, you can break elements out of the normal flow from the flow layout, the OG layout, and now by switching on off, by opt in or out of the positioning layout, so you can go with this four specific genres or subgenres. Mm-hmm. And then you have is, okay, and then you have position relative, you have position absolutely, absolute positioning, containment block. This is a particular exercise. Stacking context. We look also at the fixed positioning and the sticky positioning. Oh my god. All right. Okay. Let's get into this. Let's get into this. Shit. Okay. So you have is this. So what it does, in fact, despite that it appears to have zero effect, all right, it constrains certain children's, and we'll get to this shortly, okay, and enables additional CSS property to be used. Again, of all position layer subgenres, relative is the most subtle. So when you use this, you can often slap position relative on an element and observe zero difference. It appears to have no effect. And in fact, it's just these two things. When we opt into position and layout, we enable a handful of new CSS property, including is the top, right, bottom, and left. All right. Or in this case, they come this top, left, bottom, and right. Top, left, right, and bottom. I actually started to count from top, right, bottom, left, because this is the way of how you can apply is padding here, right? When you then specify is with the specific property. It is common to use. Mm-hmm. We can use those directional values to shift the elements around with relative position, and those values are relative to its natural position. It is common to use top and left to push things along the vertical and horizontal axis, respectively. Setting left 10 pixels push the elements 10 to the right, and setting top 20 pixels it push the elements uh, 10 pixels to the bottom. Mm-hmm. This blue box is interactive. You can also use negative numbers to push elements in the opposite directions. For relative position nodes have the same effect as this. You might be thinking that's cool and all, but I can already pushing elements around with margins, bro. What's the difference? The big difference is that position doesn't alter the layout. Mm-hmm. Notice in the visualization that the gray boxes above and below representing sibling elements don't move and they don't get pulled along for the right as they don't do within margins. When we push our relative position elements around with top, left, right, and bottom, the browsers act like an element is it still in the original position. The displacement is purely cosmetic. Compare them into this playground. This is the natural. This is when you apply now margin top, which is collapse all of the elements. And then when you put now, or when you apply top to a particular element, it's going to take that element out of the normal flow, but it doesn't impact layout. Exactly. Layout remains the same. This is a live editable code and play around and change some numbers to see what happens. Whether we use relative positioning and top or margin top, the pin box winds up in the same spot 20 pixels lower than its natural position. With margin top, though, the black boxes below the pink one get shuffled along too, like a row of cars forced to back up to let a truck turn. Similarly, when block items don't have a specified width, they can dynamically resize when, say, margin left is increased. Left, on the other hand, it pushes items around without ever changing its dimension. So, in other words, this property doesn't impact the layer, doesn't impact the dimension of that element. Mm-hmm. 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 And notice how right hand column's box sweeps out the container, whilst the left hand column box gets narrower. Which of this is better? Well, it depends on the situation, and sometimes you want to shift an items around independently, and sometimes you will want it to remain context aware. There's also a third option, using transform, which we'll learn about later on this course. Finally, it is important to know that relative positioning can be applied to both block and inline elements. This, this allows us to notch inline elements in a way that isn't really possible otherwise. Exactly, because now what you're doing is, hey, stay where you are. All right. Stay where you are, and stay where you are. I don't want you to modify this dimension. I just want us to now take the elements out of the normal flow. Okay? Exactly. Take the elements out of the normal flow and move its position. Okay. The TLDR of this. Okay? The TL uh, the TLDR of this is what the French? Okay. exactly, the TLDR is that positioned elements, positioning elements tells the browser to keep the dimension of this element and move, exactly, is to keep the dimension of these elements and move around okay. Positioning elements tell the browser to keep the dimension of these elements and move around using it is position I'll be right back. I'm welcome again. Well, the setup, the background is quite different, and also the lighting as well. But here we are, right? Let's keep looking at the positioning layout. And to me, this was today was a very revealing moment, because now somehow inside of myself, uh, by just observing, and I know that I'm trying to describe what happened. It doesn't matter if I can't accurately describe that, but all I know is that when I read calmly and somehow get myself involved into the topic, which is the positioning layout, right? I finally get it here, right? So it, to me, was a switch that say, hey, this is actually what this layout is capable of offering to you, right? So position layout. So far we have looked at the normal flow, okay? So where now the browser by default is trying to do very hard for is trying to make very hard for elements to have on the same position, to occupy the same pixel on the screen, right? But now with position layout, you can now break out of the box. So you can now put multiple elements on top of that, on the same pixel. So when we explore this position layouts, when we have is so to opt into this layout mode, you set is via the position property, and you have now is several subgenres, whether it's relative, absolute, sticky, and fixed, right? Also, we have is the static and the inline, the static and the static and the static, really, the static and the static and the initial, if you want to make an element to opt out to this layout mode, okay, to the positioning layout. I think this moment when I realize is this mechanism, is this how, is like, oh, it actually makes a lot of sense. Absolutely. So the TL here is that position elements tells the browser to keep the dimension. You can modify, of course, but to keep the dimension of these elements and move around it is position using using couple properties, using, all right, using top right, bottom and left properties. However, when we use now position property, okay, there's some couple of things that happens here. So position element, okay, this is what it is. But the relative position enables two things. First, it sets constraint to its children, set constraints to its children element. Okay, set constraints to its children elements, and enables property here. Oh my God, the internet today, I don't know what the French does with you, but the internet today has been very, very bad. It's like, the fuck is this? The French toast is this, bro? All right. You're not gonna break my focus, bro. Not at all. Not at all. Jesus. Come on. Auto connect. No, don't get me with that. Don't come with that. No. All right, but in any case, but the set constraint exactly. So relative position enable to think despite that it might look like, despite that it seems that it doesn't do anything. Mm-hmm. Well, right, we get it. We're back. We're back. Doesn't matter. We're back. Okay. So set constraint exactly. Relative position enable two things despite that it might look like doesn't do anything. Set constraint to its children elements and enables to use enable top right left and top right bottom and bottom left properties. Okay, so far so good, right? So far so good. And here we can shift those elements. We can shift the position of those elements, right? Some of you might say, hey, but why do you need here if I can move, okay? Some of you might say, hey, why do I need to have, why do I need to use this additional or additional properties when I can use margin to move an element? Position properties doesn't affect the layout, right? Doesn't affect the layout. It means that they are not going, so you're gonna push the relative position of the elements for that. Doesn't affect the layer. Okay. So actually it's not that hard to get it, right? Which notice on how the right hand column box sweeps out of the container, which the left hand column gets narrower, right? Which of this is better? Well, it's depending on the situation. Sometimes you want to shift an items around independently, and sometimes you want it to remain context aware. There's also a third option, using transform, which we'll learn about later in this course. Finally, it is important to know that relative position can be applied to both block and inline elements. This allows to notch inline elements in a way that isn't really possible otherwise. We can apply position layout to block and inline elements. For example, allowing us things like this. Allowing us things like this. But here it doesn't get that. That with other layer it'll be impossible. So for example, with this, Okay. Now let's talk about absolute positioning. All right. So far, all the elements we have seen are laid out in an orderly fashion. This particular word, the orderly, in an orderly fashion. Okay. So far, all elements. So far, all of the elements we have seen. So far, all of the elements we have seen are laid out in an orderly fashion. Are laid out in an orderly fashion, right? One on top of another, right? The orderly fashion. So far, all of the elements we have seen are laid out in an orderly fashion, right? So one after the another. So it makes sense. So we generally refer to this as inflow, a reference of flow layout, right? So one, exactly. So one, you can look at from this perspective, one on top of another, right? We generally refer to this as the inflow, as a reference to flow layout. Though this day it can also refers to other layout modes like flexbox, all right? So we generally describe this as the flow layout, all right? Despite that we have other layouts like flexbox, right? Flexbox. Good. In these cases, what if we want to break the rules, right? So what if we want to now break is this orderly fashion that we have in our elements one on top of another, right? If we want to now skip that, right? What if we want to take an element out of the orderly flow, okay, and stick it whenever we want, okay? So what if we want an element? What if we want an element? What if we want to take? What if we want to take an element out of this orderly? What if we want to take an element out of this orderly fashion and put it and stick it whenever we want, right? And stick it whenever we want, right? So in these cases, absolute positioning is our friend. Is it? So in these scenarios, absolute positioning, yeah, in this scenario, absolute positioning is our friend. It's interesting. He used now the absolute positioning as a foreign language, or something that is from the technical world. Okay. From the scientific perspective. Okay. From a technical world, from this. Okay. Interesting. Absolute positioning is our friend. Good. Cool. So we generally use absolute positioning for things like UI elements that needs to float above the UI, like tooltips and drop-downs, models, or for the decorative elements that needs to be stuck in a certain position. and stacking multiple elements in the same place like a deck of cards. And let's start with an example. For example here. So here you're telling to this element, hey, the positioning, it'll be now absolute. So keep the dimension of this element, right? And if you don't have any dimension, here's when things are getting quite interesting, right? Right? So for example, you say relative is gonna put that off the left, right? If I don't specify any dimension of this box, it's not gonna render, right? Even if I now define this as a pin box, it's not gonna render because it doesn't have any dimension, right? But if it has dimension, and you put now a position absolute here, in flow layout, we will expect this pin box to sit on top of the paragraph, right? On the normal flow, since that their order in the DOM, because our pin box use absolute positioning, though two things are different. First, it allows to go with this additional CSS property, and it also set constraint to its children elements, aka you can now hit in this pin box, add some content, and it's gonna render. This is part of the constraint of the children elements, right? And unlike relative, absolute now take things out of the normal flow, okay, and position it based on the pattern component. So for example, if I have this and I say this, it's gonna put that now using the anchor as the pattern element here, like this, right? So it's not for example, like here, right? Look at this. So the pin box is nested up into the top right corner of the preview frame. The hello world paragraph has shift up to fill the space the pin box will normally fill. And let's look at their interim placement based on the frame. This is the main things people think about when it comes to absolute positioning. We stick something in the corner or otherwise position something based on the box it is being constrained by ignoring its natural position. We can do this with 4 properties: top, left, right, and bottom, above and bottom. Above, we stock our box in the top right corner by specifying that it should be 0 pixel from the top edge and 0 pixel from the right edge. So it doesn't have to be stuck along an edge either. So consider is this. So in this case, you are, well, let me actually restore this, right? And here you say, hey, the placement of this frame, okay, it is based on its pattern, or it is based on its closest relative pattern elements, right? And this is important for absolute positioning, right? It'll be based on that. It is based on the closest pattern. It is based on the closest. It is based on the closest pattern relative element. Makes a lot of sense. Okay. So in our case, what we're saying is, hey, this selector class base, right? Where I'm going to define is the dimension, as well as the background, content background, right? And also, I'm going to make this box. So I want to make this. So I want to take this box out of the normal flow, okay, and put it, I want to take these elements out of the normal flow, put it, or anchor. This is the dimension, okay, I'm setting is the dimension of this box, followed by the background content, and I defining the anchor, and I defining is the position of this box that is gonna be anchored to. In this case, if this is relative, if you say now this is relative, it's gonna follow is the normal flow, right? But if I say, and also it's unlog is constrained to children's and an additional property, right? But if I say absolute, look at how it shift a little bit, right? And put it here. It shift a little bit because here is now anchoring these elements to the closest parent relative element. Since here it is a body, that's why it put it down there. So we instruct to the box here, okay, to sit 20% below the top edge, below the top edge of the frame, and 25% away from the left edge. The percentage is based on the total amount of space available here. So if you shrink, of course, this is gonna, well, put it that where it belongs. Notice how it is totally different mechanism from relative positioning. Absolute positioning elements are adjusted based on their container, not based on their flow position. So the alignment here, or the placement of the frame, the frame placement is based on the container, right? Is based on the container. And the question is, which container? Not based on their inflow position. To really drive to the point home, try cutting and paste a pink box to above the paragraph in the HTML, and notice that it doesn't change anything in the render output. For example, like this, right? It's putting now, cut and paste this box so that it sits above the paragraph. For example, here you have another pink box here. So cut and paste this box so that it sits above the paragraph. So I can say it's relative, and it's going to follow the normal flow. That makes a lot of sense. Cut and paste this so that it sits above the paragraph. Oh, yeah, but it doesn't work anyway. Exactly. So you can see is this and say relative, right? And it's gonna follow is the normal flow. It's gonna now push the it's gonna follow the normal flow with relative position, right? But with absolute position, things change, right? So default placement, but it's interesting because it say the percentage is based on the total of, so this is based on their container, okay? So the frame placement is based on their container. On in contrast with position relative, okay, that follow the flow position. In contrast to position relative, which follows the position, which follows which follow the flow layout, right? Default placement. Here's a question: what happens if you set position absolute, but don't give it an anchor by setting top, left, right, bottom? Okay. So what happened? Okay. Exactly. So what happened if you set an an absolute position element, right? What happens if you set an absolute position element and don't provide top and don't provide positioning, top, right, left, top, right, bottom, or left properties, right? So the observable behavior is this. It now is going to that's interesting. Is now going to behave like another flow, like another element here, right? It's actually as you can see, it's breaking the layout, right? It's taking additional space here. It doesn't line break. Yeah, it doesn't line break that much, right? Unlike if you say that as a relative, right? So now relative is actually allow us to break the word. Interesting. So position relative, when you don't put any props in fact is actually taking that. But in our case, if we say now absolute like this, right? And if we define is the top and left in zero position, what will happen? So it's going to look at the pattern. It's going to look at the closest pattern, relative elements, and sits there, right? So say, hey, top zero, and in this case it's saying that's right, and the other is on zero, is gonna take that here. Or if you say now left, it's gonna put that on the left. But look at this. Now we have put these elements, right? We pull these elements out of the normal flow, and now it is based on the container. So for example, right? If I now add some class here and say now class some p text, right? So paragraph text, and if I add this paragraph text and add some padding here, say one root element, right? As you can see, look at this. It doesn't put in the elements here. It doesn't anchor the elements to the closest pattern elements. It is anchoring is based on its closest pattern relative position, relative element. Okay? So if I say position relative, now it's gonna sit there. So try to resize the result pane. If we don't give an absolute element an anchor, it's sitting in its default inflow position, right? It sits in its default inflow position. it's sitting in its position, in flow position. Notice that the element sits more or less in the same spot. It has one other effect, though it causes the absolute elements to stack on top of the surrounding text, which takes off the second aspect of the absolute position, the effect on layouts. So see this for yourself by removing position absolute and notice that the element sits more or less in the same spot. Right? So if you say this, take it. So the element now sits more or less in the same spot. Right? It's actually line break. Right? Unlike if you put now this without adding any top or left, the element doesn't actually line break. It line break, but inside of that content. Again, this is not how the browsers render this thing. So it has one other effect, though it causes the absolute elements to stack on top of the surrounding text. It causes the absolute elements to stack on top of the surrounding text, which just takes off the absolute positioning here. Effects on layer. This point is a bit less obvious, but maybe even more important. When we set something to be position absolute, we pull it out of the flow. This is effects on layout. Right? The effects on layout. So using position absolute, right? Using position absolute. Using position absolute, pull elements out of the normal flow. Okay? So when the browser is laying out elements, it effectively pretends that absolute positioning element doesn't exist. They are incorporeal. You can stick your hand right through them, like in holograms or a ghost. To drive the point home, here's a 3 paragraph that has been set to be absolute positioning. So for example, like this, right? Because it pulls elements out of the normal flow, the browser is laying out all of its elements. So the browser lay out elements on top of that. Okay, the browser layouts elements. Exactly. The browser layouts elements pretending the absolute positioning element don't exist. Pretending the absolute positioned element doesn't exist. They are incorporeal, like hologram. You can pass your hands through. So in this case, like this. But again, this work is for text, right? Because if you say, for example, hey, this will be now P1, and P1 have a background of cerulean, right? And then you assign now this P1 here to this, right? You say, no, I don't have that. What about light blue? Light blue, right? it add that. Okay, so if I say B2, right, so I say B2, and then I want to put now here as light green, and here I want to do is this. Okay, as you can see now, it puts on top of this, right? It puts on top of this. I can say, hey, top 5 pixels, right? But I'm putting all of the elements in the same position. Say top 5 pixels or 15 pixels. I'm gonna put all of the elements in the 15 pixels. So I can say something like this, right? But because all of them occupy is the same spot here, because all of these elements, all of these boxes are occupying the same spot, the ladder will be applied like this. So the browser start by putting, you now put it this. So the browser start by putting that first paragraph in its natural position at the top of the document, but because it is absolute, it still considers that space empty. Next, the second paragraph gets added in its natural position, which is also right at the top since the container is effectively empty. This process will continue for each provide absolute elements, and be able to take an element out of its flow is super handy. Anytime you want an element to be floating above the content like a tooltip or a drop down or a model, absolute positioning is your friend, right? Pretty much is this. So being able to take elements out of the normal flow is super handy for things like models, drop down, or content, or tooltips like models, drop down. Why not drop downs and tooltips, right? And then you have now these collapsing patterns. While often the ability to take an element out of the flow is useful, there are times when it can be annoying. Consider this example. You get now a parent, and the parent collapses in it itself, so it doesn't have any width dimension. All right. And in this example, we have a pink box sitting within a black border pattern. When we toggle out of that position absolute, you'll notice that the pattern collapsed down, so it is called 80 pixel tall from the border. Even though if you don't pass anything, it'll be worse because you can see the element there. If you don't provide any dimension, you'll never see that element, right? So now if the pattern is a width, right, and the height is 25 pixels here, it actually doesn't contain that or collapsing pattern here, right? But it's interesting because now they are overlapping here. You know? So what I'm saying is that, hey, this is now the parent element. And then I want to now is draw an element based on that position there. And it is collapsing here. AKA, the position of that element will start based on that position. So for example, you say, hey, 10% and 10%. Exactly. They say, nope. Unfortunately, I don't know what 10% means because I'm looking up the parents, and those, they don't have any percentage. I am not inherit anything. So I need to set that to something like this, right? And if I say, hey, the width is now 10 pixel, 10%, it takes that, so it looks up the parent child. Exactly. It's look up to the parent to compute that. The height, if I say auto, if I say, hey, I don't know what you mean, it's like I'm looking up the down the tree to compute that value, but I don't have that, right? So if you say 50%, this is interesting because now you are calculating is this on this position L, on this positioning. But I think that is what, based on it is based on the container. And that to me is quite interesting. That is not able to take 100% that from here. But you do with the pixel. But as you can see, it is starting with that. So in this example, we have a pink box sitting within a black border parent. When we toggle on that position absolute, you will notice that the parent collapsed down so that it is 8 pixel tall, 4 pixel top border, 4 pixel bottom. Why does this happen? Well, in terms of flow layout, the parent is empty. Remember, absolute elements are like holograph. They don't really exist, and since this parent element has no children, if it's as it was an empty diff. So if I say something like this, and I refresh this, right? But if I switch this child to a position absolute, it's going to collapse, right? And it is treating that elements like an holograph, like they don't really exist. So the right tool for the jobs. You might be wondering, how do we fix this? Is there a way to stop the pattern from collapsing while still using absolute position of the child? Unfortunately, I'm not aware of any way to do this, at least not without resorting to a bunch of hacking yet. Yes, but I sort of think it's the wrong question. In general, absolute position is intended to be used in situations when you don't want it to affect its surrounding layout. If you find yourself running into this problem over and over, it's likely that you are reaching for absolute position in situations where another layout, flex, box, and grid will be more appropriate. So you talk about is this collapsing patterns. So collapsing patterns, right? So collapsing patterns is now the ability that an element renders Is it's not quite clear to me. It doesn't wrong. There's nothing wrong with this. An absolute size.
So here we have an absolutely positioned element. As it stands, it's just kind of hanging out near the top left corner of the viewport. And I have this display property. And I'm curious, I'm going to ask you the question. What do you suppose happens if I change this element to have a display property of block? Well, we can try it. Nothing really changes. And it line for the element. With positioned layout, it doesn't quite matter as much. When we're talking about absolute positioning, this value isn't used at all. The algorithm doesn't care what the value of display is unless we set it to none. If we set it to none, then it hides, like it does in every layout algorithm. But in terms of display inline, display block, that distinction doesn't make sense. There's no such thing as a block level absolute element. Where this gets a little bit muddy is around relative positioning, because with relatively positioned elements, you actually can change the display value and it has an effect. Relative positioned elements inherit a lot of their layout from whatever the layout mode otherwise used is. Relative is kind of like this weird middle ground between position layout and whatever else it is, whether it's flow layout or flexbox. So that's like a bit of an exception. But when we're talking about absolutely positioned elements, and sticky and fixed, and in general just every layout mode, every element is rendered using a single layout mode, and different layout modes use different properties. So this property has no effect for absolutely positioned elements, but then that opens a new question, which is how does an absolutely positioned element determine its size, right? Because in flow layout, a block level element is greedy and will expand. An inline element goes with the flow. We've talked about that. What about absolute elements? Well, we can kind of get a sense from what we're seeing over here that it's closer to inline, but not exactly. An absolutely positioned element wants to be as small as it can, because in general, this is kind of what you want, right? Usually absolutely positioned elements are meant to kind of stick in a given spot, and you don't want them to be growing. You kind of just want the element to be whatever it is in whatever place you put it. So it's going to shrink to fit the content. But what if we have a lot more content? And this is where it starts to get a little bit interesting. I've given it a distance from the left, but I haven't given it a distance from the right. And you might think it would just grow and grow and grow and grow, but it actually stops once it hits the right edge of the viewport. To be a little bit more precise, it's stopping when it hits the edge of its containing block, and this is one of those hidden mechanisms we're going to talk about much more very soon. For now, we can just...
It hits when it is containing...
Just think of it as this is one of those hidden a little bit more precise, it's stopping when it hits the edge of its containing block. And
it's stopping it is containing...
This is one... To be a little bit more precise, it's stopping when it hits the edge of its containing...
It stops when it hits the edge of it is containing
block, and this is one of those hidden mechanisms we're going to talk about much more very soon. For now, we can just think of it as the viewport. So this is kind of interesting, right? It grows until it reaches a point where it can't grow anymore while still fitting in the viewport, and then it forces a line wrap. And if I was to add a distance from the right, if I was to say right 32 pixels, well now, instead of it going all the way to the edge of the container, it's going to go until it reaches 32 pixels away from the container, and then it line wraps. What do you suppose happens, though, if it can't line wrap? So let's imagine that I remove all of the spaces, right? And we're going to talk much more about this algorithm in the future. Essentially, the way the line wrapping algorithm works is it looks for soft wrap opportunities. And this is things like spaces or dashes, right? Anything that it can wrap without kind of breaking the flow of the words. So when I do this, and I'm almost done here, I do kind of break my editor, which is a little bit unfortunate. Maybe this will be fixed by the time you watch this. But something interesting happens over here. The box, right, the rectangle is still going to take up the same size. It's going to be 32 pixels from either edge of the viewport, but the content is now introducing this horizontal scroll bar. And it makes sense because we've given it kind of an impossible situation. We've said that it should be 32 pixels from the left, 32 pixels from the right, and then it should also contain its content. That's how elements like to work, right? That's how the algorithm works. It grows and shrinks as needed based on the content size. But it can't really do that here. It can't grow to contain the contents because the contents are too large. So that's kind of a lot of independent pieces of information. Let's see if we can connect those dots and tell a compelling story about what this algorithm is doing. And I think the first takeaway I have is that absolutely positioned elements...
This is quite interesting that what he described, because he's looking at all of this piece of data and then create a compelling story that actually makes sense for us. So the power of storytelling has showed to me that it is effective. It works. Looking all of these different dots and then create a compelling story that makes sense. It doesn't have to make sense for me. It makes sense of based on the observable reality.
Are extremely compliant. And what I mean by that is they really want to follow the properties that we give it. So in this case, I have this really large, really unwieldy bit of content, but the box is kind of staying firm at exactly the priorities that we've given it. So we've said left 32, right 32, and that box is stable. And the same thing is true, by the way, if I use width instead. So if I was to say width 200 pixels, our box is going to be 200 pixels wide no matter what the content is doing. In general, it will try and line wrap the content, right? That's kind of its ideal, but it always makes sure to respect the priorities that we give it. If we give it some leeway, though, so if I don't set a width and I don't imply a width by setting both a left and a right, well, then the box is going to grow as large as it has to contain the contents within its own environment. So this box doesn't want to break out of the viewport, right? It doesn't want to get so large that it doesn't fit. But it is willing to allow its content to overflow. So if the content is really big, if there's no white space, or maybe it's a really large image, then that image will be allowed to overflow without the box itself changing dimensions.
So with absolute positioning, not only that you're able to take elements out of the normal flow, okay, and it allows you to set constraint to its children elements and apply some additional CSS properties. Okay, this is also true for any other layout modes, right? Whether it is flex or grid, right? They have their own additional CSS property. So we're starting to see is the mechanism. So now when we know where the element is going to be placed, all right, it's going to be placed based on its containing block, containing closest relative block. That's what it's going to be containing, right? Which is part of this, right? Which is known as the positioning, placement based on the frame. Okay, so placement based on the frame. So the frame placement is based on the container, in contrast to the position relative, which follows the flow layout. So what happens if you set an absolute position element and don't provide top, right, bottom, left property? It sits on the default flow position. All right. So the frame placement is based on its container. In other words, it is base, or to be specific, because that's where it is, right? To be specific, it will be, all right. So the frame placement is based on the container, and to be specific, it will be in the containing, in the closest relative containing box. All right, and that's what it is. Okay, holy mo. Centering tricks here. Nope. I'll do that later. So we have seen how can we position an element by specifying a distance from the edge like this, right? So top and left. So this will say, hey, distance from the top edge, 0 pixel, distance from the left edge 50 pixels, and absolute position in elements have another trick up their sleeve. We can use these properties to center the elements. Okay, by using percentage, I'm assuming. All right, by using percentage.
So this is kind of interesting. We have this pink box.
Yeah, I think we can use this percentage for doing so. Right. So if I say, for example, is make this 25% on the top, and the other is 25 pixel, 25% on the left, and 25% on the right, right? And I don't say this is margin auto. It's gonna do this, right? You say, hey, 25% of this, I'm taking is the 25% of this box, and the right of 25%. That's interesting. If I say 0, right, pixels, it doesn't change that much, right? I can even try to center this element as it is, and try to guess when this element will be center here. Now trying to guess here, and I don't think this is a good approach. So guessing here is not ideal. But what we can do here is to, hey, since this is a box, and I can specify the position of this box as well as the dimension, and then now this box, I can now, because this is the dimension of this box, right? That's quite interesting, right? I can say now margin auto for this element. So you are telling to this element to take all the available space in the left and in the right here, and also the
box.
Pretty
and we
fucked
haven't
up.
given it a size, but we have given it a distance from each of the 4 cardinal directions. And so what it has to do in order to comply with this is it has to dynamically calculate a size that essentially is the entire width of the viewport minus 100 pixels and the entire height minus 100 pixels. And this is all well and good, right? We're able to be strict with the position if we're willing to be loose with the size. But what do you suppose happens if we try to be strict about both of those things at the same time? Maybe we've had a bad day and we want to exact a little revenge on the computer. So let's see what happens. We'll give it a width of 100 pixels and a height of 100 pixels. Thankfully, the computer doesn't explode, but we don't really get, we're not complying with all of these requirements, and of course we're not, because it's impossible, right? Unless our viewport happens to be exactly 200 by 200 pixels, there's no way for it to be 100 pixels wide and stretch the entire distance so that it's only 50 pixels away from either edge. And essentially the way that it resolves this conflict is it listens to top left. It prioritizes these two sides. Usually, like those, that's the kind of origin point, and we'll see a lot of this throughout the course. Things originate from the top left. So those are the kind of prioritized sides. And it doesn't, the order doesn't matter. Like I could move top and left lower. It's not a matter of like whichever ones come first. But something interesting happens with this impossible condition if we introduce auto margins. And so we saw this a little bit in flow layout.
Exactly,
If I set
but
margin
because it's taking
auto,
all the
our
available
box
space.
moves to the very center of the viewport. And this isn't quite perfect, right? Like if we get really small, then the fact that we're still 50 pixels
exactly. Oh, it's because here I didn't set is the bottom 0 pixels here. It prioritizes. So it prioritizes this top and left, right? This is part of the origin. But you also now indicating to this element, which is a box, all right, that this is the dimension, this is what I want to put you in the top and the left, as well as the bottom, and as well as the right and the bottom. Okay, I want to put these elements here, that is somewhere here, right, in this impossible condition. And if you try to apply now margin auto, something weird happened here.
Pixels from the left starts causing problems. So in general, we want to set it to be 0 pixels from each side. That way it remains centered as long as it fits in the viewport. But this is kind of interesting, right? And I think it's worth revisiting the logic we talked about with auto margins in flow layout. Essentially how this works is the auto value is a hungry value. So it's going to try and grow as large as it can. And because we're setting margin to all 4 sides, right, both the left and right are both trying to grow as much as they can, and it kind of forces the element into the middle. In flow layout, this only works horizontally. It doesn't work vertically.
Exactly.
But with positioned layout, with absolute positioned elements, it works in both
actually
directions,
works in
which is
both
pretty
directions.
darn cool.
That's interesting. That's a very nice, interesting trick here. Still relevant, given the rise of modern layouts, algorithm, flex, and grid. You might wonder if this trick is still worth. Of course, in fact, it is still used, and it is useful. It's especially useful for prominent bit of UIs, things like models or drawers or dialog boxes. When you want to put now this specific contents on top of the user, right? You wanna annoy the user with this content in their nose, and well, so now, because margins is margin auto is a hungry value, it's taking now all the available space in the left and in the right and center the element horizontally. This is true for the normal flow, right? For block elements or in the normal flow. But here in the absolute position, it also works in all directions. Holy hell. And the inset property. As we saw, the centering trick requires setting all 4 edge property to the same value. This feels very tedious, and modern CSS is giving us a more terse way to accomplish this. The inset. The inset property will set all 4 edge properties, top, left, right, and bottoms, to provide value. It is useful for centering tricks, but also when we want an element to be inset within its parent. And this is equivalent to adding this. Okay, so in both directions, I want to take now is 50 pixels. It's taking like half and applying for both of those. This property is supported in all modern browsers. Can you say that it's available in 92.6% of users, and if you need to use it. Going forward, I'm using set regularly, and I suggest you to do as well. And then containing blocks. In CSS, every HTML element has a containing block. A containing block is a rectangle that forms the bounds of the element container. Now we're talking about containing blocks. Okay. So in flow layouts, elements are contained by their parents. For example, this paragraph is contained by its section parent, right? To be precise, the paragraph is contained by a containing block, aka the container, the class. The size and shape of the parent element context box. So is the containing block. The flow layout use containing blocks to figuring out where on the screen to place the elements. Okay, the flow layout use containing blocks to figuring out where on the screen to place elements. When it comes to absolute positioning, however, containing blocks work a little bit different. When we set the position of an element using the properties, we're positioning the elements based on the elements containing block. If our element sets top left, the elements will be nested in the top left corner of the containing block. Specifically, the closest relative containance block. The $1,000,000 question is this: how is an absolute element containance block calculated? Unlike flow layout, absolute positioning elements are necessarily contained by their direct parent. They're a bit like rebellious teenagers in this way. They won't necessarily pay any attention to their parents. Here's an example of absolute element ignoring its parent. Where it say the parent is 200 pixels in height, and now it's going to put their rebellious teenager, right? Put these elements on the bottom left, background the pink, this will be the dimension and the border, right? And now the pattern, I put it on the, so you center that element, right? Here's what's going on. Absolute elements can only be contained by other elements using positioned layout. This is really important points and a really common source of confusion. Is we add position relative to the parent class, it flips the child's containing block and will now be contained by the parents. Exactly, but you need to specify. This is when you talk about is containing blocks. And here's how an algorithm works. When deciding where to place an absolute positioning element, it crawls up through the tree looking for a positioning ancestor, the closest one. The first one it finds will provide the containing block. What if it doesn't find anyone? There aren't any positioning ancestor. In this case, the element will be positioned to the initial containing block, which is the HTML or the box size, the viewport, right at the top of the document. Here is another example. Our box is played in a Russian nesting doll, right? Or a matroska. Collection boxes only pays attention to the closest relative ancestors. As you can see, that's a good example here. It's only paying close attention to its closest relative element. So pink box is the absolute, and it's gonna put attention, and it's gonna pay attention to its closest relative containing block, which is in this case is this. It doesn't matter how many parents elements are wrapping the child, it will ignore all of them until it finds a position. It doesn't have to be relative as seen here, but it have to use position layout. Okay, it doesn't have to be relative as seen here, but it have to use position layout. Absolute, fixed, and sticky would also works. That's interesting. One last quick point, the pink box ignores the padding of the containing block and it sits right up against the border, even though each of these boxes has 16 padding. The way to think about it is padding is using the flow layout calculation and absolute elements are taken out of the flow. Those rules don't apply. So I do think that'll be all for this video. That was very interesting. Take care. Bye bye.